welcome you to Pleasant Hill Baptist Church, and thank you for coming. If you would, please turn to 469 in your Baptist catechism, or not catechism, hymnal. There we go. And sing with me, Revive Us Again.
So be reminded, of course, today we have a fellowship meal downstairs after service. And, of course, we're glad to see everyone here today. My understanding is that Brother Chad and Rick right now are, I guess, en route to Manila. And so they're in the process of coming back home. So be in prayer for them, that they'd have safe travels, no delays, no hindrances. And, of course, remember their family who are eagerly awaiting their return. So that being said, are there any other announcements this morning? All right, let's go ahead and stand and greet each other in the name of the Lord.
make our way back to our seats, please remain standing. As we make it back to our seats, please remain standing and open to 134. Jesus paid it all. Turn to 644, Count Your Many Blessings. This is our offertory hymn. So prepare your heart to give back what the Lord has given you.
Blessings, make them more. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for the gathering of everyone here to worship your name, Father. And we thank you for your blessings of promise and all that you provide for us. And we pray that we give back to thee. Thank you in Christ's name. Amen.
Probably the third or fourth time this morning, so we're off to a good start with this microphone. If you would go and be turning to the book of Job. The book of Job. It's wisdom literature. We'll see something of God's wisdom this day. again, it's the book of Job. So last week, we began looking at kind of a two-part series on worship. We began in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5. We looked at verses 1 through 11. We saw Peter's faith being made effectual. And we learned that essentially, if you don't have faith, if you're not a believer, you can't engage in genuine worship. And we saw Peter's faith being made effectual in the person of Jesus. The Old Testament fulfillment right there before him, the person of Christ. This sermon continues our exploration, our conversation about worship. What is genuine worship? What is true worship? How do you engage in worship? We're not so much worried about some methodology of worship, much as having a right heart in our worship. Job is a wisdom book. It's full of wisdom, godly living. And it's never a bad idea to stop and examine ourselves spiritually, to do some hard self-examination. And in fact, when we often do not want to do that self-examination, that often means that there's a problem we need to be looking at in our lives. We're going to walk through a portion of Job, and I'll read it as we go, but I'm not going to read it in its entirety because we honestly have a lot of ground to cover. We'll be looking at perhaps the first two chapters of Job, kind of a survey of Job in of itself. We're going to put Job in its historical context, try to understand what Job, as those who first received Job, would understand it. Okay? Then we're going to look at Job in a Christological or typological perspective. What does that mean? Christological, we know that Jesus himself taught that the Old Testament and the Psalms, the prophets, they all spoke of him. We read that, for example, in Luke chapter 24. So Jesus himself taught that the Old Testament speaks of him. So we have a confidence that when we go to the Old Testament, we can learn something of Christ. Okay? We also, this idea of typology follows with that. That simply means that in the Old Testament, essentially in history, we see a type. We see a first thing, either some event, a person, some action, some unfolding in past history that repeats itself. God is a God of order. God has a plan of redemption. And so we see an unfolding according to a particular plan, and you can see that God works in some similar ways. We can think of, if you remember Rick's sermon a couple weeks ago, where he preached the Passover of the Old Testament and how Jesus was a fulfillment of that Passover. And so that's kind of what typology does. You look for that fulfillment. It's not allegory. I'll say that at the start. Allegory is where you kind of see something and you say it's such a symbol and you create up some idea of what it means. For example, in this passage, if we were to say that these yoke of oxen or these animals, the sheep that are struck by lightning, that somehow that relates to somehow the sheep are going to be persecuted in the future, okay, that's going out there. That's stretching. That's making something up. A typology is rooted in something, and we find evidence of it. It's supported by the text. We don't just come up with our own ideas of what that is. So some of that may sound confusing. Don't worry. Afterwards, we will have a test, and so I'm sure you do fine. So this first portion here, beginning in Job, verse 1, we'll read down to verse 5. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. The author of Job establishes for us Job's integrity. You see it here. It's not laid open to question. In verse 1, we see that Job is upright, he's blameless, he's a man who fears God, and he turns away from evil. So sometimes, I think if you read the book of Job, I myself struggle with this. When you get on to the later dialogues of Job's friends, you sometimes begin to question Job's integrity. But the author here establishes it. In fact, it's the very first verse of the book of Job. So we need not doubt who Job is as a person. He's blameless, he's upright, he fears God, and he turns away from evil. Now, this is to say that he's a man such that upholds his responsibilities, and he does so in a uniform way without neglecting anything. You're not going to catch him doing something for show or doing this over here and neglecting that over there. He is blameless. Some translations render it perfect. Now, Job is not one who is without sin. He is a man who has sinned. He's fallen in nature. And in fact, there's a comment, a statement within the book of Job that says to such that how can a man be right before his God? There is this sense, all men are sinners. But Job is an exceptional servant of God. He is upright. He walks also with a fear of God. That is, he submits his will to the will of God. He submits his desires to the desires of God. He follows what God wants man to do. And he's not either or in how he does this. He's not one who fears God on the one hand, but turns to evil and commits evil. He's not one who hates God and then on the other hand pursues a righteousness that is his own, working up good works apart from God. No, he's both and. He fears God and he turns away from evil. This turning away from evil is an active action, okay? This isn't some passive, I'm going to come to church, I'm going to say this prayer, but when a moment of temptation comes, I go ahead and sin. I fall into that. But he's actively turning away from it. We know that many things happen in life, many trials and things where our faith is actively put to the test. So this exceptional servant of Job is very righteous. We have a great testimony here concerning Job. And we see that God has blessed Job. God has turned, and because of Job's righteousness, he blesses him with so many possessions. If you look at these possessions, he has 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camel, the 500 yoke of oxen, the 500 donkeys. Consider how many servants themselves are needed in this time to control those animals, to work the land. And what kind of time are we talking about? When did Job live? Well, that's honestly still open to debate. Some look at this and say that he may have lived earlier than Abraham. Some say after. But we're confident that it's in the time of the patriarchs. So it's before Moses, but after the flood. So there's not yet been the Old Testament law of Moses put in place. He doesn't yet have the Ten Commandments. He doesn't yet have the ceremonial law, the ritual sacrifices codified as to how you are to do this or that. That's not yet happened. But he's in the age of the patriarchs. And he bears the responsibility as the patriarch of the family to conduct certain things. And we'll get to that in just a second. So Job lives in roughly the age of the patriarchs, doesn't have the law, but as far as where he lives as well, we're not 100% sure. Some say he might live in the land of Edom, which is going to be southeast, kind of where Jerusalem is. Some think, though, that he lived more around the land of Bashan, which is northeast of the Sea of Galilee, near Damascus. At either rate, though that's up for debate, it does not bear too much significance on what God is teaching us through the book of Job. So as far as we see in verse 5 that Job offers sacrifices for his children. The age of the patriarchs, you saw with Cain and Abel that they had begun and were conducting a sacrificial system of some sort. They were offering sacrifices, though they had not been laid out exactly how they were to. And when we get down to this point, Abraham has also at points offered sacrifices, and in fact at one point takes Isaac up to sacrifice, but we know that that was not God's will that he actually sacrifice him. But there's a sacrificial system that is out there in some effect, and as Abraham was in charge of that sacrifice, so too Job is in charge of the sacrifices for his family, and he conducts them. He carries them out. He's a father who is concerned for his children's welfare spiritually rather than just materially. And it's nothing to him to offer up these sacrifices. He's not stingy with his land, his property, with what he would offer as a sacrifice. He prioritizes the spiritual well-being of his children. The children would gather 7 sons and 3 daughters to have a feast. Now, we don't know just how often. Some think this might be every single day of the week they gathered for a feast. Some think it's more like for birthdays. But at either rate, Job was concerned that in their mirth, their enjoying of creation, their enjoying of food, their enjoying of their sibling fellowship, that they might have so much fun that in their own hearts, they basically say to God, you know, we don't need you. This expression here in the Hebrew of curse God, you see the text says curse God. In the Hebrew, it's actually, if you were to render it literally, is to bless God. And the idea there is that you're kind of saying, you know, God be with you, bless you. You're saying goodbye in your heart, okay? Rendered to what it most nearly means, we see it means curse, someone turning away from God. And Job was concerned that his children might do so, and he offered sacrifices seeking to atone for their sin if this was their heart condition. Job, throughout this book, we see him acting in a type of prophet, priest, and king. He's offering these sacrifices, and remember that the Levitical priests would offer sacrifices. Job offers these sacrifices as the patriarch of the family. He is able to do so, himself being upright, blameless, fearing God, and turning away from evil. So we see, in a sense, the very early indication that those that God desires to sacrifice are such men as this. They're holy, they're consecrated, they're sanctified, they're set apart in order to be able to offer a sacrifice on behalf of another. We also see, in a sense, that Job is a type of a prophet. He walked upright and holy and blameless. Those who saw his life could see how a person who feared God and served God was to live their lives. He cared. In chapter 29, you see a recounting of how Job would care for the orphans in the community. He would care for widows. He would care for the needy. He would go out to the gate of the city, and people would come seek his counsel. They'd want to know what he had to say. And in fact, it said that princes would shut their mouths at the words of Job. And some men would wait for Job to speak as if waiting for the rains to come for crops. Job was one who could declare and talk about God, talk about godly living. And he lived it out. Men couldn't accuse Job of anything, and they would shut their mouths to listen for his wisdom. We know that prophets, one of the key roles they would do is to tell forth what you should live, how you should live, to turn away from evil, to turn to God. And we see kind of a foreshadowing here in Job's service as prophet. We see also that Job has many possessions and servants and family. He's got essentially a small kingdom over which he rules, and he rules righteously. Again, upright, blameless, fearing God, turning away from evil. We have to keep emphasizing that because trials are coming Job's way here soon. But we see a type of the king that he is, foreshadowing the kind of king God desires, a righteous king. So some quick application from this section. As Job interceded for his children, do we intercede for our children in prayer? Are we concerned for their welfare, especially spiritually, not just materially? Do we take the time to pray for our children, to cry out to God for their welfare, on their behalf, when they may not even know or be concerned about their sin? Do we seek out to squash, to address the sin that's in their lives? And do you fear God and turn away from evil? Or do you turn away from God and fear man? Who is it you're seeking to glorify and to appease? And do you face the spiritual danger of Job's children, wherein in the enjoying of life, the great blessings that God has given you, and God gives great things, and it's no sin to enjoy the blessings that God has given you, but do you enjoy them to such a degree that in your heart you turn away from God, saying, God, you can wait. God, your kingdom can wait. Serving you can wait. I'm enjoying life right now. I don't need you, God. When it's time, I'll come worship you when it's time. Now, verses 6 through 12, let us read these. Verse 6, Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, From where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. Verse 12, And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. We're at the scene of a heavenly assembly. It is the courtroom of God. The sons of God have gathered. Some used to believe that, and some do, I suppose, that these sons of God are angels. Some of that belief is fueled by the idea that man is simply in no way holy enough to be in the presence of God. So these must be angels. But we know that by faith, saints are sanctified and able to enter into the presence of the Lord, to enter into the heavenly assembly, to have a place with their Maker. And we see that in this scene, Satan obviously comes in to this presence of the Lord. Now, if we could have quite a discussion over this, we could spend some time, but for the purposes of this sermon, I can't go into all the possible theological ramifications or debates and argumentation that we might offer, so we're going to glance over some things. But we can infer that Satan has come to this assembly because God has invited him. God has allowed him to come there. And we see the purpose ultimately. This Satan is translated in the Hebrew, it's the adversary. We call him Satan. In the Old Testament, they didn't quite think of as the Satan, the adversary, as who we know through further revelation as the Satan who was in the garden, who tempted Jesus. Through revelation, we know that this is that same Satan, an adversary. So here's some quick points from this interaction, this heavenly assembly, this courtroom of God. First, God speaks first, and Satan must answer him. 2, God requires Satan to give an account, even though God knew what Satan had been doing. God knew everything, where Satan had been, but he tells Satan to tell him what he'd been up to. We see that Satan has been continually involved in roaming the earth, and he was seeking to devour. Reminds me of Peter when he said that Satan is like a roaring lion, roaming about, seeking whomsoever he may to devour. 4, Satan was likely summoned by God, and he had not simply invited himself in. We see that God here testifies of Job and says exactly what verse 1 has established. Job has a testimony from God, an approval from God. And what better word could there be? Satan questions Job's integrity and God's blessing of Job, thereby questioning God's justice and his policy of blessing the righteous. This addresses an idea that's called the retribution principle. That is, the righteous are blessed, the wicked are cursed. And with that comes the idea that if anything bad happens to somebody, it must be because of their sin. And we know that that's simply not true, that God tends to operate in that way. He tends to bless the righteous, he tends to curse the wicked, but it is not a foundational principle of all creation. God can break from that. None of us deserve anything good anyway, but those who walk righteously, he does tend to bless. We see that so often in the Psalms, praise to God and praise that he has blessed them with things. And David crying out that he walks righteously and desires to serve the Lord, but then we also see in such psalms as 37 this conflict where, you know what, there are some wicked people who get things, good things, that don't happen to those who walk righteously, those who are serving God. Satan is challenging God's policy. He is questioning God's justice. He's calling into account Job's integrity and saying, you know, Job is not really righteous for righteousness' sake. In fact, Job is the kind of man, he's only doing this because he knows you will bless him. Job is doing this, being righteous out of vanity and because he wants the benefits of it. Job is doing this for the perks of the blessings of God. His heart's not really into being righteous. So he's questioning Job's integrity. And by way of that, he's questioning the very presence of every other son and child of God in heaven. He's saying that these other people who are up here, they don't even deserve to be up here as well. He's questioning, he's challenging God right there. This is a courtroom scene. This adversary is laying a charge against God and God's elect. We know that God answers with a perfect servant. So Satan appeared to already also know who Job was. He did not need to be made acquainted. When God points out Job, Satan seems already familiar. He has been roaming about after all. He knows about Job. He knows about the hedge that God has set upon him. We see that God has indeed blessed Job and caused him to prosper. So not only has Job's own working in the land, his own integrity, his own discipline and hard work, he has earned that himself in a sense, but God has empowered him, and blessed the work of his hands to cause him to prosper. So Satan is seeking to test Job and thereby disqualify God's justice and Job's righteousness. And God, knowing Job, allows Satan to test Job within certain boundaries. So we see that Satan, can only work within as much freedom, with as much reign as God gives him. Satan is bound to serve God. That's a powerful idea there because you see that even though Satan's heart is turned against God and he hates God, even his hatred of God, his hatred of God's people, his desire to ruin all of creation, that God is making Satan serve him in that state of hatred. Satan is still serving God. And Satan doesn't even think he is. And he will pay for the way he's doing so. So, are you reminded that there are saints in heaven, that there is a heavenly assembly? There are saints there now who are watching us this very moment. And do you keep aware that Satan may be seeking you out to devour, to test you, to tempt you, put you in trials? And are you walking with godly wisdom? You know, godly wisdom is not some abstract idea, something that we just think of in our mind, wisdom and knowledge. Godly wisdom is grounded in practical living, daily living, how you live, how you walk, what you say, what you do. It's founded in the goodness and righteousness of who God is. Godly wisdom requires action, requires truly living it out. And thankfully, we have the whole Word of God here to point us out to how to live godly. So, with that, we turn next to the tragedy of Job, verses 13 through 19. Let us read. Now, there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them, and struck them, the servants, and all of them down with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While yet he was speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people. They are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So here, this news, this calamity, messenger after messenger after messenger after messenger comes. Job was not even given a moment to rest. One after another. Satan's attack was timed so that wherever these servants were serving, wherever his oxen were, the sheep, where his children were, these tragedies befell in such a time, and these servants were given such a time as to arrive perfectly to give this news to Job in such a tragic fashion, one after another. No time to rest, no time to gather his thoughts. We see that other men were used in this. The Sabaeans, the Chaldeans, they devised plans to gather these possessions. Job was a man who was the greatest in the east. Others knew of him. And here they come seeking his possessions. We see that this fire of God falls from heaven. This is more commonly an Old Testament expression for lightning. And some have wondered, how could lightning take out 7,000 sheep? That's a lot for lightning. It must be quite a lightning storm. But also be reminded that where the sheep might be grazing, lightning can catch ground on fire. And once a fire gets going, and these sheep burning, be quite a fire. And then you have this wind, possibly a type of desert tornado, encompassing, surrounding, and just demolishing this house all at one time, killing all of Job's children. It's tragedy. It's bad news. And we see next how Job takes it. So verses 20 through 22. Then Job arose and tore his robe, and shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job did not sin, or charge God with wrong. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In that first heavenly scene, that heavenly assembly, Satan had charged that, once I do this, Job will curse you to your face. It's that expression again of bless you to your face. He will depart from you. He will turn away from you. And we see here that as Job is crying out after all this, the very thing he does is genuinely bless the name of the Lord. He accounts him as good. This isn't that expression, that idiomatic expression that he's going to depart from the Lord. This is a genuine testimony of God's goodness. It's quite a thing after all that had befallen him to in that moment to be able to say that of God. It tells us again what we knew in verse 1, that he feared God. He turned away from evil. He knew who God was to some degree. We're seeing that Job is here. He's worshiping God in the revelation, the light of what he knew of God, what he had at this time. We're so blessed, and sometimes we take it for granted. We have so much revelation, so much history to look on, the fullness of everything, that we can see how God's working. But Job here, he did not know in the midst of his trial why it happened. He knew what had happened. He knew the pain. And there is a pain behind this text which only those who've experienced the loss of children, the loss of everything they had and hold dear, that only they can relate to, the loss of loved ones. There's a pain here that is real. And I think all of us at some point in our lives will find ourselves in Job's shoes, wondering what God is doing, wondering the hard questions, the why this has happened. But Job, he knew something of God. He knew God. And he worships. He falls down. He counts himself as nothing, humbling himself when he was yet upright, blameless, revering God, turning away from evil. So it's after this scene that we have an update. It's a second heavenly assembly in heaven. It's another attempt of Satan's we see chapter 2, verse 1. We'll start reading there. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Satan again is persistent. We see that God testifies Job has maintained his integrity. After all these things, Job is still righteous for the sake of righteousness. Because he knows God, he fears God, he turns away from evil. Satan still doesn't get it. Satan still doesn't understand the knowledge of God, the wisdom of God. And Satan thinks that he really is going to foil Job, his integrity, and foil God's own testimony. Because he's already been successful once, has he not? In the garden. He was successful there. God's first man, Adam, fell. And he thinks, okay, so God's putting forth this Job as another example. You know, Adam was sinless. He was without sin when he fell. This Job has sinned. And Satan is thinking he's merely being righteous based on his knowledge of God, based upon what his submitting to God. Surely Job will fail. He's wrong, of course. And God again permits Satan to attack him. Now, how is this attack? When we look across the book of Job, we see descriptions in different places of Job's physical affliction. And a quick description and summary of it is this. This is Job's condition after Satan's attack on him. Job has boils all over his body, which he is scraping with pieces of pottery. His skin hardens and pieces fall off of it. Scabs develop, dry up, and then break open again with oozing. He feels hot to his bones, possibly from a fever. He cannot sleep and has nightmares. Some of his sores have become so infested they have maggots or worms in them. He is stressed and filled with emotional turmoil and anxiety, a churning of the stomach. The greatest stress you can imagine eats him at his core. And he's lost so much body weight and looks so awful that when his friends show up, they don't even recognize who he is. And when his friends show up, we'll get to hear in a moment, he's sitting on a trash heap outside the city, away from his own city. There on a trash heap, suffering in misery and horrible affliction. Verse 8, and he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." Verse 10, but he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Verse 11, now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept. And they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was great. Now, after this, Job opens his mouth after apparently 7 days and nights of silence. His friends waited on him. They saw his suffering, they saw his affliction, they saw his condition. For 7 days and nights, Job sat in misery, a pile of ashes, suffering, emaciating, wasting away. We see that after Job begins to speak of his situation and to even begin to curse the day that he was born and to look back and say, what is God's purpose in all this? He's struggling, and he does struggle. As we see the dialogues unfold over the next 30-something chapters, we see that he struggles. Despite all the good that has happened, despite his knowledge of God, he struggles. He does absolutely struggle. But soon into the dialogues, his friends who had come to comfort him, while Job is sitting there on this pile of ashes, in this horrible state of affliction, they begin to accuse him of sin. Remember that in verse 1, we saw that Job was blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. We saw in the heavenly assembly, God testified to that as well. But soon, and because of that retribution principle, remember that if something bad happens to you, you must have sinned. You must have somewhere. And Job's friends come thinking that, and seeing him in this state, and seeing Job begin to complain about the pain he's in, they basically say, listen, Job, you've sinned. You've done something wrong somewhere. And your children, let's face it, whatever transgression they had done, whatever they had sinned against God, God has delivered them now into the fullness of their transgressions. He delivered them over to the punishment they were deserving. Job's on the defensive now. In this horrible state, after losing all these possessions, after losing his own health, his friends now have turned against him, and his wife had just turned against him. He's a man alone with no one to speak for him. They accuse him, unrelenting. And that's the tone until we get to the end of the book of Job. And then we see God come forth and speak. And God declares some things. God speaks of his wisdom. And most of what God says is in the form of questions, rhetorical questions. And I'll read a few of those, but for time's sake, we certainly can't go into all that he has said. Verse 38, I'll read. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge, dressed for action like a man? I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? And when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Who shut the doors of the sea when it burst out from the womb? He speaks of the stars and the ordinances of the heavens, how things unfold, the turning of the stars, the creation. He speaks of the birth of animals. He speaks of these creatures, Leviathan and Behemoth. And he asks Job, do you know of these things? Did you create all these things? Are you in control of all these things? No. Job is brought to a point having to shut his mouth and be silent before his God. In one sense, Job is satisfied. He is satisfied when he hears God declare his wisdom and his power and his sovereignty. Job shuts his mouth, and that is enough of an answer for him. What we learn is that God's wisdom is beyond our searching out. It's beyond our understanding. God's wisdom is infinite. He knows everything from the end from the beginning. God knows it all. We are not in a position where we can question God's wisdom. We know so little. How much of us truly know the Holy Word, front cover to back cover, every iota, every dot and jittle? We don't. And yet would we say that we know everything of creation and know everything from the beginning of existence for us, to know of these heavenly assemblies, of God's choice in eternity past? We only know what God has made known to us, what He's revealed to us. And it's in the light of what He has revealed to us that we worship. So Job's vindication, which God does vindicate Job. But the answer to why Job was suffering is not really explained. Job doesn't know what we know. You see, Job didn't know about the dialogue between Satan and God. And when God appears at the end of the book of Job, God doesn't tell him about that. So Job finishes not with an answer to his suffering. but he's met with God, who is the answer to our suffering. So it's a challenge, and sometimes we would like a prescription. We would like an explanation as to exactly why our suffering has befallen us. But we know from the full testimony of Scripture that suffering doesn't befall us simply because of our sin. God may discipline us because of our sin in order to bring us back to Him, in order to lead us to Him, to keep us walking as His children. But do not think that because of some suffering that you have encountered in your life, whether it's personal or through family, that was because purely of sin. God's purposes sometimes are beyond our understanding. There's a mystery in suffering sometimes that we just have to simply shut our mouths, be humble before God, and wait upon our Lord. We don't have all the answers. And to say that we know, and that we know why exactly God has done this, is wrong. And let us not be like Job's friends. So often I think the temptation exists in the church, especially on Wednesday nights, where often we share struggles. We express prayer concerns. We hear of cancer. We hear of these things that the church is filled with now. And sometimes in the back of our mind, that idea pops up. I wonder what their sin was. I wonder what they might have done. That's wrong. That is a satanic statement. At that moment, that's being the adversary. We have to repent ourselves of that. We don't know what's happened. God may be glorifying Himself through their suffering, and we know that He will. We may not know how. And God will glorify Himself through your suffering. We may not know how, but He will. So, we lack wisdom to question God's justice. Job is vindicated, and we see that his wisdom is beyond our searching out. Now then, I spoke of Christology and typology, these big words. I want to point out where in this text, where in Job's life, we see Christ. Because for us, we know that we can look to Christ, and He's our answer to suffering. He's our consolation. So, let us look at that. And one last comment. We saw, of course, at the end of this section, at the end of Job, that Job is blessed again. That God gives him double possessions. Gives him again 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. So God goes on to bestow upon him greater blessings than what he had before. As just a point that God's policy of blessing the righteous, and Job had proven himself to be righteous, that God is just in doing so. So, first point in our Christological look, Job was a type of priest, prophet, and king. And as prophet, we know that Jesus taught repentance from sin, desiring all to turn to God by faith in the gospel. He told of what would happen to unrepentant sinners and urged them to turn from their ways to avoid judgment, and he spoke of the great blessings upon those whom believe. As priest, he administered the perfect sacrifice, himself. Jesus offered himself. Jesus was without sin, blameless, perfect, upright, fearing God, and turned away from evil. He was qualified to be able to offer the perfect sacrifice. And as the perfect sacrifice, he could accomplish once for all time what no sacrifice in all of history could accomplish: full atonement. And as king, Jesus established a righteous kingdom whose subjects are holy and righteous, set apart for genuine kingdom service. And this kingdom is one without end, without suffering, and will be full of joy, a perfect kingdom. Number 2, as Job was a type of a father interceding for his children, so God's perfect intercession for sin, the sin of man, is the fulfillment. And God accomplished what man on his own could not do. He gets all the glory. Job gave burnt offerings. God gave his son, who voluntarily went to the cross that we might all be called children of God and be made co-heirs with Christ. Number 3, as the heavenly assembly in Job is a type of the gathering of the sons of God in the adversary, so the final judgment is the fulfillment when all sinners and saints alike will be called into the courtroom of God to be given an account of what they've done on earth. Those who have believed upon Jesus will have an advocate with the Father, not an adversary. As Job's own wife scorned him in the midst of his suffering, so Jesus brought this to its fulfillment. Jesus came unto his own, yet they did not receive him. Fellow Jews who Jesus had come to redeem mocked him and suffered as he suffered upon the cross. Some who first scorned Jesus, though, later confessed faith in him. These were a part, or are a part, of what sometimes Jesus referred to as the bride of Christ. Jesus is the bridegroom who's come to reclaim the bride. He's come to die for those that are his bride, the church. As Job's friends questioned his integrity, accused him, and abandoned him in his hour of need rather than defend him, so Jesus brought this to fulfillment. Judas turned Jesus over to be arrested. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. The other disciples scattered. A Jewish council accused him of blasphemy. And at the height of his suffering on the cross, Jesus was mocked by all those that were around him. As Job had gone out to a trash heap outside the city to suffer and endure painful physical affliction, Jesus brought this to fulfillment by being beaten, mocked, spit upon, given a crown of thorns, led out of the city, nailed to a wooden cross, in hunger and thirst, pierced, and made a spectacle as people watched. As Job was tempted by Satan to turn from God, so Jesus was tempted to turn from God. Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness with thoughts of a provision apart from God, with a kingdom which he could earn without serving God, and which he could achieve without suffering. We saw that Jesus did not turn away from God, but he served God. He rebuked Satan with Scripture, and he went on to suffer and do all that God had purposed for him, submitting his will to the Father's will. As God interceded in Job's case and vindicated him, so God brought this to fulfillment in interceding in Jesus' case, resurrecting him from the dead and proving Jesus' innocence and his claim to be the Son of God. Jesus is put in the place of greater honor, authority, and blessing than even before his affliction. So in summary, Job was such an exceptional person who had merited God's favor, yet was put forth by God as a demonstration of his justice and his righteousness. God demonstrates that some will endure. Indeed, some will endure suffering for the sake of righteousness. And Jesus fulfills this. He brings it to its climactic fulfillment, that everything in the Old Testament reaches its epitome and its climax in what Jesus did and who Jesus was. Jesus had done nothing to deserve what he received, but he willingly received it in submission to God to make righteous those who are unrighteous. Job's suffering may have vindicated himself, but Jesus' suffering atones and vindicates all of us in the courtroom of God. In both the case of Job and Jesus, we lack the wisdom to fully understand the fullness of God's purpose and plan. There's a mystery in the gospel. We just don't quite understand. How could a God who's so righteous, so holy, so full of justice, who is love and mercy and grace, how can he love sinners such as us and purpose to save us? We can't do anything for him. We can't, and even after he does this wonderful work for us, sometimes we try to turn from him and we need his preserving grace. It's amazing, and there's a part of it in which there's a mystery. We don't quite understand just how glorious our God is. So, as God reminded Job during his suffering of who he was, what God had done, and what he could do, and Job refocused on God, he was reminded that true contentment is not based upon one's circumstances, but is based upon knowing God. We are reminded during our suffering of who Jesus is, what he has done, and what awaits us. We refocus on our Lord and Savior, and God in the flesh, Jesus Christ. Our contentment, likewise, is not based upon our circumstances as much as we may desire them to change, but our contentment is based upon knowing God through the Son through the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit. Our response to all these things should be worship. A person who does not believe in Jesus will likely not understand these things. Jesus is hardly the prescription for their suffering that they're looking for. I cannot offer you, though, any greater consolation for your suffering, for your trials, for your doubts, than to look to Jesus. Persevere, dear saint, for yet a little while, and then glory. Do not grow weary from doing good, and do not stop seeking peace with all men. God is not yet done calling sinners home. The heavenly assembly has enough room for all who will come. And until that time of calling men home is done, we must persevere through whatever circumstances we find ourselves. Be reminded of, James spoke of Job, who endured with such great patience. He endured, he had patience. And Hebrews 12 speaks, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance this race that is set before us, fixing our eyes upon the author, the finisher, the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. We run with endurance, fixing our eyes on Jesus, knowing there are trials, knowing there are tribulations, knowing that we will suffer, but we look to Jesus, fixing our eyes upon him, knowing there is a heavenly assembly who has already passed through many tribulations and trials, there awaiting. They have gone through such things. Jesus, ultimately, more so than anyone. So let us strive to do this in the joy of the Holy Spirit with full assurance, in whom we have believed. And we should worship him in all circumstances. Worship him always. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Let us worship him always. Let us pray. Father, we must be honest that your wisdom is beyond our searching out. Father, sometimes we cry out to you and we're seeking to know more, Father, to know exactly why things happen the way they do. Father, we struggle with our own sin. We struggle with the suffering. We struggle with the loss of loved ones, Father. And we cry out, why? And sometimes, God, you don't answer us the way we want you to. God, cause us to be humble before you. Cause us to walk rightly, upright, that we would be blameless, that we would fear you, Father, that we would simply set our will to your will. Our desires become your desires. And God, help us to look to Jesus Christ, whom you set forth, Father, as the fulfillment of all that which you spoke of, all that you taught us would come to pass. He is the one who has achieved atonement for us, Father, complete and full atonement. Father, we wonder how this can be. Holy Spirit, move upon us, move upon the proclamation of this word. Fill us with an understanding, teach us, instruct us, help us to live this out. In our trials and suffering, cause us to look to Jesus. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Sorry about that. So before we sing, I just wanted to ask a couple questions. All right, raise your hand if you are married. Raise your hand if you've ever been to a wedding. Right? Everybody has been to a wedding. And as you know, we are the bride of Christ. And when you're at a wedding, something that you always hear is the vows and having much and in having little, in sickness and in wealth, till death do us part. I just kept thinking about that through this. We are the bride of Christ. In sickness and in health and having much and having little, we should praise him. And something that is much more glorious than an earthly marriage, death will never part us from Christ. It will only bring us closer. So as we think about that, open to page 2. Let's worship our God and sing Holy, Holy, Holy as we stand. Trinity. Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee, casting down the golden crown around the glassy sea. Cherubim and seraphim falling down before thee, who wert and art and evermore shall be. Holy, 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 though the darkness hide thee, though the eye of sinful man thy glory may not see, only thou art holy, there is none beside thee, perfect in power, in love and purity. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, all thy works shall praise thy name in earth and sky and sea. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity.
Well, I was glad to see everyone today. Of course, we have the fellowship meal after service. Everyone's always invited to join us for a meal together in a time of fellowship. And are there any other announcements before we dismiss? Okay. Brother Roger Goostrey, do you mind closing us out in prayer, brother?